So a very good morning to you. You're very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. My name is Mark Gibson and I'm head of the Teagasc KT Outreach and Innovation Department. This series is brought to you by Teagasc in collaboration with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, the National Rural Network and Food Drink Ireland SkillNet. And today I'm joined by Pat Murphy, who's going to be helping us with questions later on. Good morning to you, Pat.
Good morning.
And just before we introduce our speaker, I just want to talk about the topic we're going to be discussing today. And the Agricultural Catchments Programme is an intensive monitoring programme of farming's impacts on water quality across Ireland and is coordinated by Teagasc. An important part of this monitoring programme is soil fertility. So I'm delighted to be joined by Eddie Burgess, who is a catchment science specialist with the Agricultural Catchments, and who's going to talk to us about soil fertility trends in the Agricultural Catchments Programme. Eddie, good morning to you.
Good morning, Mark. Good morning, Pat. Good morning to all the people viewing and listening in.
So you're both coming to us from County Wexford this morning. Am I right in that?
No.
No. Where are you coming from, Eddie? I should have asked you that earlier on.
I'm quite confused where I'm coming from, Mark, to be honest. I'm on the border of three counties between Carlow, Wicklow and Wexford, but I'm actually in County Wicklow, just.
Okay. So it's nearly right. So Eddie, maybe you could tell us a bit about the work that you're doing. Those who aren't familiar with the Agricultural Catchments Programme, could you tell us maybe a little bit more about that and how that fits in to the bigger picture in terms of water quality?
Yes, Mark. The Agricultural Catchments Programme, we've presented here a few times before and given an overview of our whole programme, but we're established now in almost 14 years, and we're funded by the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine to evaluate the measures that are imposed under the Nitrates Directive, the Good Agricultural Practice measures and its derogation. All quite topical just at the moment, because every 4 years the Nitrates Directive gets reviewed and the measures that are included in it are some of them are usually changed. And in previous reviews of the Nitrates Directive, most of those changes have been favourable in that there have been a relaxation of restrictions on agriculture. They've allowed people doing things at a longer period in the year or increased application rates. But it is likely with the environmental focus and trends in water quality and gaseous emissions, all the topics that are being discussed here in these webinars are putting pressure on at the moment, and it's likely that the current round of the review of the Nitrates Directive is not going to be as favourable as it has been in the past. But we're very key and central in that, and we report every year to the European Commission on the impact of the derogation. It goes through the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Housing, but the EPA and the Catchments Programme make up the bulk of the science that goes into that review of the nitrates derogation.
Great. Okay, Eddie. Well, that gives us a good overview of the Catchments Programme. So if you could perhaps share your screen with us, and we will get into the presentation. We should issue a health warning at this stage. There are quite a few graphs in your presentation, so unfortunately, we didn't get the opportunity to send people 3D glasses for your presentation, but I think you have a really strong story to tell in those graphs. So Eddie, we'll hand over to you. Just before we do, just remind everybody that you can submit your questions to us through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And also today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Teagasc website in the next days along with the presentation, and also the audio version will be available on the Signpost podcast. So Eddie, we'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark. Before I proceed with the talk, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge a lot of help that's come in from one of my colleagues in the Catchments Programme. Simon Leach is a technologist working with our programme, and he works with a database for a lot of the results of what we call the spatial data, the soil fertility and other things that are happening out in different locations around the catchments are all recorded, and Simon has done a lot of the number crunching on the details that I'm going to go through with you now. So just to say thanks to Simon on that. what I am going to go through here, really, first of all, as I mentioned, the Catchments program is a water quality evaluation program, and people may ask, why are we so involved in soil analysis and soil samples? So I want to give a quick overview of that and how we do it in the Catchments program and what we do. Having done that, I want to look at the trends in soil fertility that we have found since we started in the Catchments program. I know that Pat and David Wall and Mark Plunkett produce a publication every year on the trends nationally on all soil samples that come through Teagasc, and it's a very useful and informative publication. Where our soil results and our campaign differs from that is that the soil samples that we take are from the exact same fields. We do a soil sampling campaign every 4 years, and we go out and resample the same location in the same field in the same manner. So we can look at the exact trend in a field, on a farm, or in a catchment. And in today's presentation, I'm going to go through the comparison between different catchments and different enterprises. And I do apologize in advance, there are a lot of graphs coming up in the presentation, but really when I want to try and show trends, that's inevitable. And finally, I want to give a couple of implications and like you to consider what is happening with phosphate, uses of organic manures, and on the pH and soil type, and the implications that that has on the soil trends. So the Catchments program in general, as I mentioned, is evaluating water quality, and water quality for the Water Framework Directive. I think the biggest single factor that needs to be improved for targets under the Water Framework Directive is river ecology. At the end of the nutrient transfer continuum, as we call it in the Catchments program, but nutrients have to come from somewhere. There is a source of nutrients. They may not make it as far as the river or the estuary or the lake, and they may not have an impact when they do get there. But if they aren't there in the initial place, they won't be a problem. So the main reason why we are looking at soil fertility and taking soil samples every 4 years is to get an assessment of the source of nutrients. And nutrients that cause a problem in water quality are nitrogen and phosphorus. They're the two main nutrients that cause a problem for eutrophication. Phosphorus largely in freshwater bodies, and nitrogen is the limiting nutrient largely in saline or marine waters. And the measures being implemented under the Nitrates Directive may be targeting different locations along this path. And we're familiar, there are stocking rate limits, there are fertilizer limits based on soil samples, and on your stocking rate and the crop type and the cropping history. And these are all source limiting measures in the Nitrates Directive. They may have an impact on stop, but in some cases, it doesn't take a lot of a nutrient to cause a problem. And that is the mobilization stage. And mobilization, for example, if you plow a field of permanent pasture, you're going to release a lot of nitrogen that was previously tied up as organic matter. It gets mineralized, and in a mineralized form as nitrate, it's available to be leached. So that's the mobilization part of it. And there is measures for stopping the transfer of nutrients with buffer strips. And recently we've seen a lot about the delivery of nutrients into our estuaries in the east and southeast, with the total load of nitrogen that is getting there and the impact. So that's just an overview of the approach we're taking, but the very start of it, we're looking at the source of nutrients, and that's why we go out and do these soil analysis. And we have 6 catchments in the program, but for 3 of them, the 3 southernmost catchments, they're the ones that got established first. And in those, we have now taken 4 different soil sampling campaigns. First of all, in the winter of 2009 and 10, sorry, not 19, there's a misprint, beg your pardon. Then 4 years later, and 4 years later, and then last winter, a year ago at this stage. And as I mentioned, it's the same area sampled every year, and it is stored in a database that Simon is working with. And it's the standard soil analysis tests that we do: soil pH, the buffering capacity, phosphorus, and potash. And more recently, the Catchments program has taken on a role for climate change and carbon sequestration, and those we're sampling the soils also for carbon content. A key point is that the farmers in these 6 catchments didn't choose to partake in the agricultural catchments program, and they weren't looking to evaluate the nitrates directive. So there was a lot of work by advisors working in the program to encourage them to work with us. You can imagine they would have been quite hesitant and maybe apprehensive when they heard that they were involved and located in an area for assessing the nitrates directive. But the single biggest, if I was to pick a single factor that encouraged farmers to work with us, it was the fact that we sampled their fields and went out and presented the results and discussed nutrient management planning with them. So not only are these soil samples used for the researchers in our program, they also are a key part of our advisory role and are keenly sought after by the farmers. There's just over 300 farmers in the program, and they're very pleased and keen to know what their soil fertility levels are. And I would under observation from the 4 campaigns, each time we go out and do a soil sampling campaign, the level of interest and demand for the results increases. So pH, soil pH, I think is like the foundation of all nutrient management. And I'm just going to go through first overall in the 3 catchments in Timoleague and the 2 catchments in Wexford and Ballycanoe, just to look at the soil pH. And I have broken it down into different bands there, from soils above 7, between 6.5 and 7, 6.2 to 6.5. So they would be the 3 bands that we would ideally like to see our pH in, and then suboptimal would be below 6.2. So from 6 to 6.2, 5.5, and below that. So these are the bands of the pH. And you can see over time, from the first campaign, the soil pH has improved between the first and the second. And then it took a significant jump into the 3rd campaign and is not quite so good at the last campaign. In the last winter, the pH seems to have dropped back a little bit. This a significant increase here in 2017 and 18 did raise a lot of questions for me. I was kind of thought that was an exceptionally high jump, and I'm wondering why this happened. If we were to follow the trend between the first, second, and last soil sampling campaign, they seem to be more consistent, improving the whole time. But there seems to be an exceptionally high improvement here in 2017 and 18 in the 3rd campaign. And after looking into it, I noticed that the same jump took place nationally. So we are in line with national trends for soil pH across the 3 catchments. But also, I think it is worth noting that when taking a soil sample, we would not recommend taking one within 2 years of spreading lime. That there is still lime, it takes 2 years for the lime to become fully incorporated into the soil and adjust the soil pH. Because we are going out and taking a sample every 4 years, some of those fields that we have sampled would have had lime applied in the previous year, in the same year, previous year, and the year before that, and that wouldn't be advised from a nutrient point of view. So there may be a certain level of inaccuracy and exceptionally high pHs shown in the 3rd campaign because there was a high amount of lime sales in the years running up to that. The phosphorus trend across the 3 catchments is declining and declining gradually. I have broken the p-values into the indexes. Index 1 is very low. Index 2, low. Index 3 is the optimum agronomic and environmental combined target that we would like to see. And index 4 would be high, considered high. Under the regulations, usually no phosphorus is recommended under index 4s. For environmental reasons, and also because it's deemed that there isn't a response to P fertilizer or fertilizer at index 4 levels. So I suppose you could say, unfortunately, across the catchments, the P levels are in a slight decline. Potash, on the other hand, is increasing. I often say that K is the forgotten element, and I attend a lot of meetings with people on environmental and water quality issues, and potash does not cause a problem to water quality directly itself. However, potash is a key element in nutrient management, and nitrogen use efficiency will be significantly impacted if the levels of K are inadequate. And if nitrogen use efficiency isn't what you would like it to be, it's going to be lost somewhere along the line, and those losses potentially could end up in the environment, in the atmosphere, or in water quality. So through good nutrient management, soil pHs and soil potash levels should be at their optimum. And they are moving in the right direction across all catchments. If we break it down into individual catchments and we look at Ballycanoe, it's a heavy soil catchment in County Wexford. It's predominantly grassland, high clay content. It's an Irish Sea mud that was pushed up by the glaciers and left behind 10,000 years ago, and prior to that in previous glaciations. We can see here that the pH is increasing, and again, it did increase significantly in the third campaign and has dropped back a little bit, but the overall trend in the pH is moving in the right direction. However, it is lower than we would like to see, and there is significant room for improvement in the pH in Ballycanoe. In contrast, in the tillage catchment, which is only 20 minutes to half an hour's drive away, the pH is significantly better. And it's ironic in that the soil here is naturally more acidic, but there is a history of sugar beet in the area, and the farmers there appreciate the value of lime and soil pH, and are very, very much aware of the benefits of that. So the pH was good at starting point and has improved. So you can see the category, the sections that are in the pH of between 6.5 and 7 has grown. And being a tillage soil, we would say that the optimum pH is 6.5. This graph is a slightly different way of showing the trends in tillage fields across the 3 catchments. And what I'm showing here, at the first campaign, the blue line represents, at this point, this is all the soils that have the pH below 5.9. And if we looked at what happened to those very same soils in the second campaign, the pH increased. And again, up to around 6.4 in the third campaign, and has leveled off there. And the soils with the exceptionally high pH have dropped gradually, but there seems to be a convergence of the tillage soils to a pH of close to 6.5. And again, that is desirable, and that's what we would be looking for.
And
I think there is a legacy of high pH soils in the Castledockrell catchment from factory lime, which was spread as a byproduct from the sugar industry. And those are gradually falling. For dairy farms across all 3 catchments, again, there is a convergence of the pH. The lower ones have improved significantly, and the higher pHs have dropped a little bit, but the convergence is closer to 6.1 or 6.2. Not as high as we're seeing in the tillage scenario. And in dry stock, across the 3 catchments, is very similar to what's happened in the dairy. I think it's important to just note that at this time, the previous slides I was talking about the actual pH of the soil. When we take a soil sample, it is also analyzed for a thing called the buffering capacity or the buffering pH, and the lime requirement is calculated from the buffering test. And I have compared here the lime requirement in the three catchments: Ballycanoe, a clay soil, Castledockrell, a free draining shale, a bedrock soil, predominantly tillage, and Timoleague, an intensive dairying, free draining soil over sandstone. So we're comparing the three soils at different pHs. So if we look at the Ballycanoe soil at a pH of 5.8, to change that pH to optimum, we need just over 3 tons of lime per hectare. In Timoleague, at the very same pH at 5.8, we need more lime. We need close to 5 tons to bring the pH to optimum. And in Castledockrell, we need even more again. So it's important to distinguish the difference between soil pH and lime requirement. And different soils need a different amount of lime to bring them to the optimum. Some soils will resist a change in pH more so, and that's why we do a buffering test to calculate the lime requirement. That sometimes can be a little bit misleading or confusing. Why is the pH so important? And I'm coming to phosphorus now. I'm tying this soil pH in with phosphorus, and this is some work that was done by a PH student in the Catchments program, Roman Herbert, and he did a more detailed analysis looking at the total phosphorus. The example here I'm showing is in Ballycanoe, and he compared it with the Morgan's phosphorus, and he also did a Malick P. Some of the results here will tie in very much with the new soil sampling program that the Department of Agriculture have launched recently. In these two soil samples, one of them was acidic and it had a pH of 5.6, and the other one, a very similar soil type, but it had a pH of 6.3, the optimum pH. There was analysis done for the total amount of phosphorus in that soil. Most of this is bound and not available to plants. And in the acidic soil, there is considerably more phosphorus at 1350 versus 878 in the one that has the correct pH. However, when we look at the Morgan's P, which is considered to be what's plant available, the amount of phosphorus in the Morgan's P is higher, even though the total P is considerably less. So the acidic soil, what is happening here, if it goes below pH of 5.8, aluminium in that soil is binding that phosphorus tightly and is making it less available. And it's been locked up by the soil, resulting in a low Morgan's soil test. So it's important to have the pH correct to make best availability of the nutrients that are in that soil. The P index in Ballycanoe, I mentioned that the soils are more acidic there than we would like. And I think that has an influence here on this graph. You can see that the P index at the start in Ballycanoe wasn't very good. There was a significant number heading for 20% in index ones. Heading for 40% and a similar amount again in index 2. So almost 80% of the soils were suboptimum for P alone, not to mention pH and potash. And unfortunately, in the campaign since, that problem has steadily got worse up until the third campaign, and it now seems to have leveled off. And there seems to be a very slight improvement in index 3s between the third and fourth campaign. Okay. I think it's worth noting here that Ballycanoe soils are fantastically good at growing grass, and the farmers there will probably say that the yield in grass yield isn't by being hit with these low levels of phosphorus. However, if the trends continue with that like that, it will eventually come to have an impact on the yield, and it'll bite them. In Timoleague, we have a contrasting scenario in that the P levels were starting off were quite good. We had over 50% index 3s and index 4s, and they were pretty steady. They did decrease coming up to the third campaign, but there has been an increase. The worrying here from an environmental point of view is there has been a slight, very slight increase in index 4s coming up to in the last campaign, from the third to the last soil campaign. So in the last 4 years, there has been a slight increase in index 4s. And from a water and environmental point of view, I think we would rather see that increase being in the index 3s. The trends in phosphorus in this graph is similar. If we look at the P index 1 and 2s in the first campaign and see what happened to fertility of those fields across 12 years, really for dry stock farmers, they haven't changed. The biggest change is the fields that had high levels of phosphorus have reduced significantly. That's a good news story from the environment. Unfortunately, we haven't seen an increase in the index 3s, which is the category that we would like to see. On dairy farms across the catchments, and Timoleague has a high proportion of these farmers in it, so I suppose this is reflected in the previous slide. We can see that the index 4s did drop up to the third campaign, but do seem to have turned a corner and increased slightly again. Those soils dropped from an index 4 down to an index 3 in the third campaign, but the average result of them has moved up into index 4 again in the last campaign. And in tillage for phosphorus, index 3s and index 1s and 2s have largely remained relatively unchanged. And the index 4s, there was a legacy, as I mentioned, of factory lime, and I think they are dropping gradually and seem to be leveling off kind of at a high index 3. The index system for tillage fields is slightly different. The varmints are slightly different, so they are now all index 3. Potash, I mentioned, tends to be the forgotten nutrient, and in Ballycanoe, you can see here that the trends for potash are increasing. The index 4s are getting better in the last campaign, the index 3s are improving, and the index 2s have remained pretty much unchanged. And the low index 1s, while they had increased a bit, it seems to have turned a corner and they're now improving again. In Castledockrell, in the tillage catchment, I think this is a good news story. It has taken maybe a little bit of time to get it started, but in the last 4 to 8 years, the levels of potash have increased significantly. And I think we're getting better nitrogen use efficiency as a result of that. And it's through good nutrient management and interest in the results and good advisory that this has taken place. And in Timoleague, there is also an improvement in the K, but it is not as significant as is there for the tillage farmers in Castledockrell. So we can see that the trend here for the soils that were in K index 1 and 2 is that they are moving up. K index 3 are gradually moving up, but not moving significantly. And the index 4Ks have dropped slightly over the 12 years of the campaign. And in dry stock, that's quite similar. Dairy farmers, there seems to be a gradual improvement in K levels. And in tillage, equally, the K levels are all moving in the right direction. Tillage farmers, through my own experience working as advisors with them, with the first campaign, they were keen to take the soil results and look at take the information and the advice on fertilizer management, more so than on grassland-based dry stock and dairy farmers. when we came out with the trends in soil fertility and talked to the farmers about how their individual field and farm fertility levels changed from one campaign to the next, the level of interest in nutrient management has increased. I mentioned Roman Hebert did some work in the Catchments, has done his PhD on soil fertility. And I think a lot of the reason why the nutrient soil fertility levels in tillage are moving in the right direction quicker and more so than on grass-based is that there is less use of organic fertilizers and more use of chemical, higher proportion of chemical fertilizers being applied to tillage fields. So with that in mind, Roman did work comparing cattle slurry versus chemical fertilizer in 4 of the 6 catchments that we were working in. And we can see here that the yield in grass and dry matter was in general much the same, if anything, slightly better than chemical fertilizer at the same application rate. Particularly in Ballycanoe and Dunleer, there was a significantly better response from cattle slurry. In Craigduff, it was the same, and Timoleague, it was more or less the same. There was no significant difference. He also measured the nutrient loss from phosphorus to water in those, and cattle slurry, it was actually safer, and the soil binded and held on to phosphorus from cattle slurry more so than it did from chemical fertilizer. Overall soil fertility across all the catchments, when you look at pH, P and K, it has improved very slightly since the first campaign. These are the results from the last campaign, and we can see that overall 85% of the soil samples and 85% of the area that we're looking at does not reach the optimum agronomic levels. And if we include an environmental evaluation into that, there's a further 7% that have P index of 4 that we would like to see coming back into the index 3. That's overall. Averages can hide a message, and if we look at the story in the Ballycanoe catchment, it is significantly worse. 95% of the soils are not optimum. 2% in P index 4. In Castledockrell and the majority of the soils here are tillage, and we're talking about a pH of 6.5 versus 6.3, so we have a higher target, and yet 77% of the soils are optimum. 8% are in P index 4, and that is declining over time. In Timoleague, 81% are sub-optimum soil fertility levels, and the concern I have here is the proportion that are in P index 4. Okay. So what does this mean, and where are we going for the farms in there? And in advance of today, I was looking at a slide that Mark Plunkett presented to advisors in Teagasc about a month ago, or maybe 6 weeks ago at this stage. And he came up, he was showing the fertilizer prices in last year versus 2021 in August, how they have changed since the start of the year, and they've gone up. They had gone up by €200 a tonne. And yesterday I rang the merchants in Tullow in County Carlow, and they have actually gone up by another €200 since then. And they were actually reluctant to quote me because fertilizer isn't moving at the moment. It has gone so expensive. And if we see still a significant proportion of fields at sub-optimum fertility levels and fertilizer prices getting higher and higher, you would be concerned that soil fertility levels and production are going to be significantly hit if this high price regime continues. In addition to that, we have policy implications in advance of this rise in fertilizer. These were all here. Farm to Fork from the European Commission is looking for a 20% reduction in fertilizer use. And if those fertilizer prices maintain, I don't think there will be any problem in achieving that. A 50% reduction in nutrient loss. Also, the EPA have been publishing this year a significant amount of details on nitrate load entering the estuaries in the east and southeast of the country, and outlining the trends moving upwards, which is away from the targets for the Water Framework Directive. Greenhouse gas commitments that are going to be outlined next week and are being discussed largely. The three gas, well, for greenhouse gas, we have methane emissions, and there's not much we can do to reduce those without reducing livestock numbers, but nitrous oxide emissions through improved management and for nutrient use efficiencies can be improved, and are a main focus for agriculture to improve technology to get more per kilogram of nitrogen applied. So we'll be looking for improvements there, and ammonia in a similar way. So there is a lot of focus on nutrient management. Okay, Mark, that's presentation.
Okay, great, Eddie. Thanks so much for that. Reminder, everybody, do use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. And I think you really told a story there, Eddie, very well of the trends that are happening across the catchments in Ireland. And I fully acknowledge the graphs are really important part of telling that story. I
am sorry, Mark.
Not at all. No. I think you did it. I think you did it very, very well, actually. I imagine there are people looking at today's presentation and wondering, are we looking at the fertility in our soils from a narrow viewpoint? Because I see some comments coming in through from farmers there who are maybe don't have the objective of maximizing agricultural production from their land, where in fact maybe their objective is to pull back on their stock numbers and to work on the whole building biodiversity and approaching it from that perspective. Would you care to comment on that in terms of maybe even just looking at the phosphorus indices there? Maybe is a P index 3, is that important for everybody, or are there farmers there that perhaps don't need to be hitting those sorts of indices? It's just if you know where I'm coming from on that.
Yeah, no, I do, Mark, and I agree completely with the sentiment or the question. I think it's a very good question. I suppose really a comment on the index system by and large. The index system is a simplified tool to help us make decisions and it was developed for agronomic production. Index 1 is very low, and it says that, and the definition of Index 1 is that agronomic response to fertilizer is definite. Index 2 is considered low, and the definition is that response to fertilizer is likely. 3 is medium, and where we say that all soils should be, and it's deemed that the agronomic response is tenuous. It might happen and it might not. And Index 4 says that the response doesn't exist, that there isn't one. Across the different soil types, for all nutrients, for phosphorus and for phosphorus and potash and other nutrients, in the different catchments, we've discovered that the index system and those definitions don't always fit. For example, with the tillage farmers in Castledockrell, those soils are naturally high in potash, and many of them are in a high Index 4, and the farmers there still get a response to potash fertilizer and are putting it out on top dressing with 20-0-15 on spring barley, and it's getting a response. So the definition for Index 4 is that there wouldn't be a response to it, and yet they are finding a response. Equally, in Ballycanoe, the P levels are very low, and farmers are measuring and growing a lot of grass in Ballycanoe at low P index levels. But they are all production targets that I'm talking about. Really, I think if you're not, it's understandable that people would think that Teagasc's message is that all soils should move to Index 3, and my presentation probably contributed to that. But really what we need to do is have fertility levels that want to reach the objectives that the farmer has. If that farmer is an intensive tillage farmer and he wants to maximize his production, it's very important that he has his pH right and puts on an adequate amount of nutrients. If it's an extensive farmer, for example, someone maybe in the Burren Life program and they're receiving payments for biodiversity and species-rich grassland, putting on excess amounts, putting on optimum amounts of nutrients for perennial ryegrass production don't make sense. So that's where I think looking at the trend in fertility is important, because you could be in an extensive system with biodiversity and species-rich pastures as an objective, and if your fertilities are increasing through maybe mismanagement of organic fertilizers, you need to be aware of that and take action to reduce it. No different to looking at a trend for a production-minded intensive farming system.
There's a kind of a follow-on question which I think will allow a bit of nuance in terms of what you're talking about. And the question is, I only apply 60 units of nitrogen. Do I need Index 3 for P and K? And I suppose what the person is getting at is, what are the priority elements that I operate or that I aim for first?
Yeah. I suppose it's difficult to say, Patrick. That person's saying they're applying 60 units of nitrogen. What are their objectives? Well, first of all, is it a grass? I'm assuming it's a grass production system. Different soils will behave differently for different nutrients. As I showed there, the soils in Ballycanoe will grow grass at a lower P level to what's there in other soils. But the pH and the availability of those nutrients is the cornerstone to that. So for someone applying lower amounts of nitrogen, if they're production minded, the pH is key and first and foremost before they should start considering about altering their P and K levels. And I think I would look at the trend in the parts per million of the P and K. I didn't do that in the graphs there. Mostly I was looking at the index system, but on an individual farm and a field basis, I would be looking at the actual result in milligrams per liter or parts per million.
The slide you showed there with the fertilizer prices, it's actually staggering to look at the change that has happened within the space of less than 12 months. What do you expect the response to be to those prices at a farm level? And you know, are farmers going to reduce their nitrogen and or maybe reduce their phosphorus applications and take a holiday from that side of things? Or you know, what do you think is the response going to be? And are there measures that farmers could put in place? Because we have spoken a lot about other ways of bringing nitrogen onto the farm outside of using chemical fertilizer.
Yeah. There's going to be a little bit of a broken record in my responses, Mark, but the one price that I haven't put up there is the price of spreading lime. Okay, and first and foremost, there are a lot of nutrients available in the soil already. I showed the amount of total phosphorus that was in the soil. I didn't explain about nitrogen. Like in a hectare of nitrogen tied up in organic matter on a grassland field, you could have between 8 and 16 tons of nitrogen. On a tillage field, you could be talking maybe between 4 and 8 tons of nitrogen. If the pH is optimum at 6.3 for grassland or 6.5 for tillage, the maximum amount of that organic matter that can be mineralized will be. So it will release nitrogen itself. And the samples there and the trends that I've shown in the catchments, which are no different to what's happening nationally, show that there is still a lot of scope for lime to be spread. So I think when fertilizer prices are going up, one of the first things that should happen is that pHs need to be moved to where they need to be. The second and equally as important option that is available there, and we have observed in the catchments, is the use of organic fertilizers as opposed to chemical fertilizer. And I mentioned that the tillage, the trends in fertility in the Castle Dockrell and on the tillage farms and the other catchments is by and large better and moving in the correct direction. And the reason for that is the majority of the nutrients being applied are being purchased through chemical fertilizer. On livestock farms, we have organic fertilizer applications, mostly cattle slurry, but also imported. There's pig slurry, digestate from anaerobic digesters, and poultry manure being applied. And the decisions based around organic fertilizer application rates do have significant room for improvement. The decisions that go into a farmer's mind, which impact on when and where they spread the organic fertilizer, are not always purely determined by the nutrient requirement of the crop and the soil fertility. If you have slurry storage up to a certain amount and your tanks are full, you need to spread it. It takes time to travel with spreading it. You're going to spread it on your driest land, and you're going to spread it on fields probably closer to where it's been stored. And we can see that in our results in the catchments. So there is a lot of scope for improvement in nutrient management with organic fertilizers, and they work. Also, I didn't show a slide on this, but on Roman's PhD, he compared poultry manure, pig slurry, and cattle slurry with chemical fertilizer. And from a plant availability point of view, pig slurry and poultry manure will release, for the same amount of phosphorus fertilizer applied, they will make a more significant change in plant availability. Won't be any riskier from a water-soluble runoff solution, with the exception of pig slurry close to spreading time. And cattle slurry, as I shown there on the slide that I did show on the trials that he uses, is statistically the same, but probably marginally better than chemical phosphorus.
We've just about 10 minutes left, Eddie, and with lots of questions coming through. So I'm going to hand straight over to Pat, and maybe if we could try and give a rapid fire round and try and get through as many of the questions as possible. So,
one, Eddie, I know you've answered before. Was there much of a correlation between soil fertility and nutrient levels in water?
No. Yes and no. Across the 6 catchments, the classic example to say that there isn't is the Ballycanoe catchment. It is a heavy soil type, and at the start I showed the slide with the nutrient transfer continuum. Phosphorus is usually of concern with a runoff type soil. So if you have a high clay content, they get wet quickly, and the type of rain that we had here in Wexford yesterday was so heavy that the soils would have got saturated and water would have run off the surface. So the soils there, ironically, also have the lowest P levels of all 6 catchments, but it has the second highest P loss to water of the 6 catchments. And so there are different factors that impact on nutrient, and I suppose the key message from the catchments program is you need to put the right measure in the right place, and limiting phosphorus application in Ballycanoe is not going to improve or reduce the risk of P runoff. It's the timing of application and the location of application that will make a difference there. It's about breaking the pathway, which is a runoff scenario. In contrast with, I suppose maybe with the Timoleague catchment in Cork, that the pathway for phosphorus being lost, we have found that phosphorus moves through groundwater there, and high soil fertility levels on that soil type would be risky, and they have potential for increasing it. So sometimes yes, and sometimes no, and we need to understand
in relation
the process.
Right. A question there in relation to the kind of levels of index 3 and the fact that they're generally not increasing. Is there a problem with the distribution of nutrient around the farm that we're not seeing an increase in level 3 and decreases in index 3 and decreases in index 4? Or
yeah, but I suppose I'm coming back to my comment on applications of organic fertilizer, and Nolan MacDonald did research comparing 2 tillage catchments in the catchments, one which had a higher proportion of organic fertilizer being applied, and I'd say there is a problem there with management of nutrients coming from organic sources. For example, people could be applying organic fertilizer as a source of nitrogen for growing crops, but they do organic. They're not a straight. It's not like spreading muriate of potash, or so that they're supplying organic matter. They're supplying nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, sulfur, and they're supplying many benefits to the soil. But if it's been put on from a mindset of nitrogen alone, there could be an imbalance of other nutrients going out.
just a comment here you might comment on, is Teagasc trying to maximize farm production or farm profit? And just saying they're not the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's a very good comment, and I think a significant Mark Plunkett is going to have a lot of work calculating tables on economic response from fertilizers to look at farm profit and the optimum amount being applied with those changes in prices there. But again, I think for grassland-based systems, grass measuring will tell people how much their yield of grass is per field. And my opinion why tillage farmers bought into the soil results and nutrient advice much quicker than on grassland-based systems is that, in general, if you're not budgeting grass, you don't know what your yield from an individual field is if you're selling milk or selling beef or selling lamb. If you're a tillage farmer and you're selling spring barley or oilseed rape, you know what came off each field and you know the impact of inappropriate nutrient management. Now, if you are budgeting grass and you know that your P-index 2 fields are growing 16 ton and you're utilizing 14 ton of grass of a P-index 2, that should be your target, and stick with that. And no one knows that better than the farmer that's working on that, has grown up and is working on those soil types themselves. The index system is a good system for general advice and putting it there, but they need to be nuanced and tailored to individual soil types across the country. And it's farmers that are working on those that know their own farm best, and advisors working in the locality that know that to make those decisions.
Okay, there's a question there in relation to, and I suppose it maybe harken back to your own experience as an advisor in the catchment, asking what has worked with farmers to get improvement in soil fertility management amongst the farmers in the catchments.
A continuous declining trend or a continuous increasing trend rather than a snapshot of the soil fertility at a single time works well. And one thing that I haven't shown there is that the fertility levels, I showed the trends in fertility levels between enterprise and between catchment. If you look at an individual catchment and look at soil fertility between one farm and another, you will see marked differences. And Simon, I mentioned, uses GIS and he can produce color-coded maps for soil fertility. And if we look at a catchment and we color-code it for pH, or we color-code it for phosphorus or potash, you can identify farm boundaries from those color-coded. So nutrient management is a farm-specific thing, and it has influenced the fertility on an overall farm basis to an extent that we can identify one farm from another based on the soil fertility levels. Sorry, Pat, I'm after getting a little bit.
No, that's fine, and I think that's quite clear. There's a question there, a double or two questions. I'll put the two of them together. What are the risk factors for losing nutrients from land, and what are the kind of specific advices that need to be given to farmers in different circumstances to try and prevent that loss?
That's a long answer. It depends on the nutrient, and it depends on the soil type, and it depends on the weather. Okay, from a phosphorus point of view, by and large, it's a runoff scenario, and the timing that you apply the phosphorus is key. So rather than the total amount, if you can put out phosphorus at a time when runoff is not likely to happen, in other words, application of phosphorus when soils are not saturated and heavy rainfall is not forecast, then it's less likely to cause a problem. And remember, the amount of phosphorus needed to exceed limits is very small agronomically. We're talking about less than 1 unit per acre per year that will cause a problem. So rather than talking about overall phosphorus application rate, I think it's to do with soil conditions when it's been spread, and buffer strips, and avoiding what we term as critical source areas, which contribute to an excessive amount of runoff. Nitrogen is a completely different pathway that it gets into the soil, and really from a nitrogen point of view, we're talking about excellent nitrogen use efficiency. In other words, that the nitrogen that you put out is removed in crop offtakes, and avoiding excess application rates, and avoiding nitrogen being there at a time when growth is minimal or non-existent.
Eddie, there's quite a few questions coming in around the types of assessments of soil health that we're doing. We had Fiona Brennan on the Signpost series a number of months ago talking about the biodiversity aspect of soil quality. Is that something that is being examined within the Catchments program, or are there plans to take that aspect or understand that aspect of soil health?
We do collaborate with a lot of researchers, and we'll be working closely with Fiona and some of her, sometimes she will carry out some of her work on sites located within the catchments, and the other mostly PhD students, but by and large it's not a major focus of our work in the catchments. Okay. But soil fertility and the levels that I've gone through here are only one aspect of soil health. Soil structure and soil texture. Texture is obviously we can't change. The sand, silt and clay is there, but the soil structure and compaction, and the soil pH equally, I think, is key to both soil health and soil nutrient availability there. Okay. And I mentioned we are measuring carbon now as well, which will tie in with that.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up there. We're just right out of time. Eddie, thank you so much for your presentation. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to get through all of the questions today. There's a lot of interest in this topic, so Eddie, we might get you back again on to talk about maybe those other aspects that we were talking about there as well. But I think it is important to say that, and you've said it there, that we're only looking at one aspect of soil health here today, and that there is a more holistic view that we're taking, and obviously more research is required in that particular area. Okay, Pat, thanks for helping with questions. Eddie, thanks again for your presentation. And just to let you know that we'll be joined next week by Dr. Catherine Keena, who's going to be talking about assessing biodiversity management practices on intensively managed farmland. So do join us next week for Catherine's presentation. And a reminder again that today's session is recorded and will be available on the Teagasc website along with the presentation. And you can tune in also to the Teagasc Signpost podcast series, which will give you an audio version of what's been presented here today and all previous webinars as well. So with that, we'll leave you and we will talk to you next week at 9:30. Have a good weekend and enjoy the Halloween break. Okay, thanks everybody.
Mark and Pat.